is presented as the vector of pathology in ways that would have had tremendous resonance in the 1970s when this ad was appearing. So that's the easy part. I mean, when I do my research, basically looking back through time, when you look back through these representations, you think, what were those people thinking? And it's interesting to think how social mores and social assumptions change so dramatically over time. And so the harder part is to say, what are the images that surround us now? What are the assumptions that surround us now that seem comfortable or invisible or second nature to us that 15 or 20 or 50 years from now, people are going to put up at conferences using like PowerPoint version 97 or whatever they've got by then, and people are going to say, what were those people at the time thinking? And so I want to move now into looking at the present day and say that really what I'm trying to do is use history as a way of understanding images and representations that surround us in the present moment. So to answer that, I'd like to switch from looking at pharmaceutical advertisements, which is what I've been talking about, to two studies that I'm doing looking at the advent of gender stereotypes in the era of Prozac. And the first study was a study that was published several years ago that looked at the advent of gender stereotypes in American popular media. Basically, what I did with several of my students at the University of Michigan was did an extensive study of gender themes in American media. And the way we did this was by looking to two electronic databases. These are great databases, the LexisNexis Guide and the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. These are electronic databases where you can do keyword searches for words that appear within the text of basically every newspaper and every magazine. And we looked for particular words. We looked for gender, antidepressant, depression, and Prozac. And we looked really in the years surrounding the Prozac phenomenon. So we looked in the years between 1985 and at the time we stopped in 2001. And what we were again looking for was articles that used the words depression, antidepressant, and Prozac were the main ones. Now you might be thinking, well, that must have been a zillion articles, and that's true, it was a zillion articles. So what we then did was just use every fifth year. So we pulled articles from 1985, 90, 95, and 2000. And then we pulled articles from just every January, June, and December. And then we pulled every sixth article from that. So we went from a sample size that was enormous to a sample size of roughly 200 articles from the nation's leading, by circulation, 100 leading newspapers and magazines. And these were articles that talked about either depression somehow or Prozac somehow. And then what we did was we got these popular articles about depression from the period 85 to 2000, and we developed a three-part coding scheme that helped us get at some of the gender themes that were involved. So the first part of the coding scheme looked at general trends in the articles. This is an article about depression. Where did it appear? What kind of linguistic use was it? Was it, I'm holding some Prozac in my hand, or we live in a Prozac nation? Importantly, where in the newspaper or magazine did it appear? And most important for our perspective, what was the gender and the race of the people who were assumed to have depression in these popular articles? So part one was general information of the coding scheme. Part two, we basically coded for the use of DSM terminology that appeared in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual from either the later versions of the DSM-3, depending on the year, or the DSM-4. And we literally just counted how often did the terms depression, depressed mood, irritable mood, et cetera, how often did these popular articles about depression use DSM-type terminology. And the third part was coding for what we called non-DSM terminology. These are terms that may well be related to how people experience or think about depression, but they're specifically terms that are not mentioned in the DSM. These are what we called cultural reference, and the terms we looked at were marital status, marriage, motherhood, fatherhood, sex, menopause, work, sports, and a series of other, again, cultural reference, terms that were not mentioned in the DSM. And then what we did was we coded these articles. And so I just want to give you a few kind of bullet point findings from this particular study. First, we ended up coding 261 articles, 180 newspaper articles, and 81 magazines over the length of the study. what we found is that in popular media representations of depression at this time, the age roughly approximated kind of age of onset data about the onset of depression. So roughly 72% of the people were between 19 and 45. We saw a spread, as I was suggesting before, from the use of Prozac as a noun to the use of Prozac as an adjective. And we also, interestingly, in the newspaper data, saw a spread from the health sections to the fashion and style sections. And the key point of this, if there are any cartoon characters, there was a cartoon woman tank girl who wore a necklace of silver-dipped Prozac. And I think if you're making a wonder drug and you're trying to wonder, like, will it succeed? I think that was the ultimate success for them, was that, like, after that, all these runway models in Milan and Paris were wearing these Prozac necklaces in the late 1990s. Gender, again, predictably, roughly approximated the norms we might expect. So there was roughly a 2-to-1 variation in articles that mentioned depression and depicted somebody as suffering from depression, 98 to 64. There's a whole other story about race, but basically in the first 15 years of the Prozac phenomenon, this was coded as a whiteness phenomenon. We looked across everything, and then we also did a separate search in Essence, Ebony, and Jet, 3 publications that are directed at African American populations. And across all of this, we found that basically 95% of the people at this time who were represented as being depressed were also assumed to be white. And this was actually true also in the populations directed at African American communities. So several of the key findings from this study. First, in terms of the DSM versus non-DSM criteria. And don't forget, the DSM terms were the terms from the DSM. The non-DSM terms were the terms from culture, marriage, et cetera, et cetera. And what we saw was an increase, not much going on in 85, but over the course of the first 15 years of Prozac, an increase for women in the use of non-DSM terms and a decrease in these articles in the use of DSM terms. Now, what was interesting is we also saw an increase for men in the use of these non-DSM terms. So what was happening was, over the first 15 years that people were starting to talk about Prozac, popular literature was increasingly using these cultural terms and decreasingly using psychiatric terms. So you might be wondering, were those cultural terms the same in women and men? And luckily for us, they were not. These are the women's non-DSM symptoms. In other words, the cultural symptoms, the cultural words used in American media to talk about women's depression. This little brick graph is women's work. And so, at least in the American media in the first 15 years of the Prozac phenomenon, nobody was talking about women getting depressed in relationship to their work. This little yellow graph that goes nowhere was aggression, athletics, and sports. But this mauve graph that goes from about 5% in 85 to over 90, it was like 92% by the year 2000. So over 9 out of 10 of every article in the American media that was talking about women and depression was talking about them. Anybody want to guess what this particular one was? We called it the 4 M's: marriage, motherhood, menstruation, and menopause. And a few examples of that. Articles basically were saying, I felt miserable. My family life was falling apart. Our marriage was under great strain, and God forbid my husband had to take on most of the housework and childcare. A depression so severe I feared I'd never be a normal mother again, and some articles less about PMS. Now, those are the women's non-DSM terms. The men had very strong statistical significance as well, but very different from women. This brick graph was men's work. So by the end, you could see about 40% of men, their depression was linked to their work. This little mauve graph was the graph that was so high for women. So if you think, like, did men in the media get depressed because of their emotions or their roles as fathers or boyfriends? And according to the media, that's about 12% of men. But there was this strong shoot up in a different category, which was aggression, athletics, and sports. And what we would see was articles again and again that either talked about Prozac as being a kind of performance-enhancing drug in sport. So there was a famous marathon runner, Alberto Salazar. He won the '84 gold medal in the Los Angeles Games, and then he basically sucked after that and didn't win all these races, and he tried new shoes and new shorts and new insoles and everything, and he couldn't get anything going. And then he went to see a psychiatrist who gave him Prozac, and there were all these articles basically saying he's taking Prozac and he's winning again. I talked about race before, and one thing I should say is we ended up having to control for Mike Tyson, the boxer, in our study, because every time that he would bite somebody's ear off or threaten to eat their children or something, there'd be all these articles in the media, Tyson is off his Prozac again, even though Tyson was actually never getting Prozac. And the other point was every time that there was a shooting spree or some kind of act of violence, we're actually seeing this again right now in the United States, there would be again and again replaying, here's the public conversation that we can have about men's mental illness and mental health, and it relates to sports and aggression. Now, very quickly, we did a control study to look at similar trends in antihistamines, because antidepressants and antihistamines were the number 1 and 2 most advertised medications. And I'll just say we found no gender trends in the antihistamine group. Very quickly, I'll say that there's a second follow-up study to this study that we're just finishing right now. And what we did was took the cultural message that we had. We took the message about here are the gender stereotypes that were being used in the American media, and we then tried to apply that message to medical charts. And so after a long and very arduous process, we actually got access to a big series of, for us, I mean, I'm talking as a historian, but we got 300 or 400 charts from the University of Michigan healthcare system.